thanks very much for inviting me. A slight change of pace now, because unlike our two excellent previous speakers, I'm not a natural scientist. I'm not a scientist of any sort. I'm a writer, and I'm actually writing a book on this stuff, which has led me to think a little bit about it. And so I wanted to share with you a few thoughts about the nature of the motion. And I want to start off by pointing out to you briefly that not thinking about engineering the climate is what is historically odd. The fact that we ask ourselves, is it time to think about engineering the climate, would, throughout most of modern history, have been a strange question, because through most of modern history and through most of the history of climate science, people have thought about that, because people have thought about society and the climate as things which act upon each other and which interact in interesting ways. And so here, for instance, is Buffon, the great natural historian of the 18th century, in his Époque de la Nature. Man is able to modify the influence of the climate that he inhabits, to fix, you might say, the temperature at the level most convenient to him. This is not an odd view for Buffon to have. This is an entirely normal view for men and a few women of the 18th and 19th centuries to believe. They believed mainly, though not always, that by growing and cutting down forests, humans had a large influence on the climate, and that they could use that influence for good. So, I mean, other people and climate is immensely important to these people, to people in the 18th and early 19th century, in a way that it isn't to people in the early 20th century, because they invest a lot of their thought about what sort of person you are in terms of how you interact with the climate, how your civilization interacts with the climate. So climate is a very big topic for them, much more bigger topic in the Enlightenment era that I'm talking about than it was to the early 20th century, where climate was just a bunch of numbers about annual rainfall. And they thought very seriously that they should be involved in modifying the climate. Thomas Jefferson, for example, is very keen on modifying the climate. He's keen on having a Panama Canal cut, so to increase the modifications that he thinks. And most educated people, not all, but most educated people of his time and class think that by turning the earth from forest into fields, you improve it. I'm not saying that they were right. I am saying that through most of our modern history, over most of 200, 300 recent years, this is the way that we've discussed the world. I talk about Jefferson. If you look at the great climate crisis of the early 19th century, when a volcano called Tambora erupted, and there was a large but short climate shift all around the world, the response from everyone, from people writing editorials in newspapers in Dublin, who say we must start moving icebergs around more to deal with this terrible change in the climate, to the French Interior Ministry, who say every department must report to us now on its climate modification plans. No one thinks that climate is something that simply needs to be left to itself. There's a particularly strong version of this history in various histories of colonialism, and I should just actually add to this. I can slightly speak to what Matt was saying. I've had the great privilege of going to Ascension Island, an island that had its climate deliberately altered in the 19th century by the creation of forests where it had previously been entirely desert. And of course, there were unintended consequences. The obvious one of, yes, you put cats on the island and they eat all the birds' eggs. But also, you see, if you go to Ascension Island, that humans are able to deal with unintended consequences, at least to some extent. There are no longer any feral cats on Ascension because they were removed with extreme prejudice. And there are now seabirds returning to Ascension. And I've seen the fairy terns flying in the forest where there were previously a few ferns, and it's not the worst thing in the world. So, people throughout our recent history think that the right thing to do with the climate is to interact with it, not to simply try and keep it static. And this idea continues. This is not just an idea of Enlightenment philosophy. Is that counting down or up?
Down.
Bugger. Okay, this is not, so the first major report on carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect that went to an American president, which was called Restoring the Quality of Our Environment in 1965, said more or less exactly what Buffon would have said. It said the climatic changes that may be produced by the increased CO2 content could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. The possibilities of deliberately bringing about countervailing climatic changes therefore need to be thoroughly explored. And that's all I'm arguing for, by the way, thorough exploration. I'm not saying we should rush into geoengineering. I'm saying that geoengineering helps us think more broadly about climate. And I think very specifically, we have seen from 1970 through to about 2000, 30 years, and very particularly in 5 years from 1987 to 1992, we saw the way people talk about climate narrowed down spectacularly from a broad view to a very specific view that carbon dioxide is the problem and must be regulated. I have no problem with the idea that carbon dioxide levels are a big problem and that they need to be dealt with in many different ways. But the idea that you can collapse a very big problem, which, as Matt and Peter were pointing out, exists on timescales of centuries to millennia, to what we decided was the most straightforward way of dealing with it between 1987 and 1992. This seems to me to be a totally unnatural and unhelpful hobbling of the imagination. Because if we don't think about geoengineering, that doesn't mean we don't do geoengineering, because geoengineering can take place without a large public discussion. An example would be the fact that in the 20th century, humankind geoengineered the nitrogen cycle in a large way. Humans now fix more nitrogen from the atmosphere than all the bacteria of all the Earth's soils. 40% of the nitrogen in the proteins and DNA in your body comes from a factory that made the fertilizer. This is an extraordinary change in the way the world works. It was done at some levels deliberately, but without large public scale discussion. And if the public had been involved, we might have done it better than we did. So seeing that I'm going to skip over a few things now, we could come back, if you like, to why I think we very severely narrowed the discussion on climate to a discussion on carbon dioxide in the 1990s. But the other thing to remember, I'm calling in general just for a broader discussion, but we must remember that the narrowing down to carbon dioxide not only gets rid of alternatives, it also, to date, has not worked at all. The carbon intensity of electricity generated in the world today is exactly what it was 10 years ago. The carbon intensity of energy throughout the world has in fact increased somewhat since 1990, a period which has also seen more people raised from poverty than any other period in history. And so the idea that we can just reduce carbon dioxide may or may not make sense seen from as far in the future as Buffon is now in our past. But I suspect that we need to think more broadly about our relationship with the climate, about how we adapt to it, about how we attempt to modify it, and how we attempt to stop doing harm to it. It seems to me to say that we're only going to have one or at most two of those discussions is to shortchange the world. Thank you.
So we have questions from Helen and Matt.
I'd be interested to know what kind of scientific research program you might want to start if you were thinking in those kind of terms.
I want to think about. I mean, I'd be interested in a program that would look first of all at how one might monitor changes that one might wish to bring about in geoengineering. But I actually don't want to start a scientific research program at the moment. I do want to see a broader discussion of how and why and in what ways humans are best expected to care about nature and to care about each other. So I don't think that I think there is a tendency to say, oh, let's narrow down on the scientific program immediately. There are interesting scientific research programs, and there are some particularly that you might want to see taken ahead, and I would be interested in finding out what sort of aerosols you can put in the stratosphere without harming the ozone layer. That would be, to me, an interesting question from various points of view. But I'm not saying that this is a thing to be done, you know, in the next 5 years in a rush. I'm saying that a civilization which dominates the processes of an Earth system should think about how it actually manipulates or doesn't manipulate that Earth system. It should not say, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to try and do nothing, because it's fairly clear that doing nothing, well, it's fairly clear that doing nothing in terms of omitting nothing is not going to happen. And so you do need some balance between what you think you might like, what you're very afraid of and want to forestall, what you think you can do by changing behaviour. But remember, you have to change the behaviour of people who may not want to change their behaviour. We've had a thriving socialist movement in this country for centuries, and it has achieved some great things. But it does not mean that we have come through to a socialist paradise. I don't think we ever will, alas. But we have seen great changes as a result of that. I think that the environmental movement can tell us lots about sustainability, but it's proved very hard to make a large majority of people want to change their lives in a way that would help the planet avoid the need for the sort of things we're talking about.
Do you think there are lessons to be learned from recent endeavours by scientists and engineers involving technology? I'm particularly thinking about GM and nanotech, in terms of making the debate as even and as fair and as broad as possible.
Yeah.
And what are they?
Well, without wanting to, I think making the debate even and fair, and I think that's true from both sides. I mean, there's been in the GM debate, we've seen disinformation from people who are in favour of some forms of GM, and I think we've seen disinformation from people who are against some forms of GM. I think the problem is, if we don't, I mean, go back to the language of emotion, the way to think well about geoengineering, and I'm willing to accept that at the moment thinking well about geoengineering is saying we can't do this at the moment, so we shouldn't. But that's not the same as not thinking about it. And it's this kind of choice restriction that I find very distressing, because maybe pragmatically, if choice restriction was really working, I might be able to suck it up and say okay. But I don't see any evidence that it is working. And so I think a broader discourse about how you best serve your fellow human beings and the natural environment just needs to have this broader perspective. And I quite agree. I mean, slightly back to Helen's point, I would certainly want to have the broader discussion out ahead of and around the scientific discussion. I don't want this to be a discussion led entirely by scientists.
So we have time for some questions from the floor.
So is geoengineering regarded as a permanent or a temporary solution? Because maybe there's an underlying risk of dependency on technology and manipulation of the Earth via this tool, or is it clear until when will geoengineering be used?
I think that's a very good question. I think most people thinking about climate geoengineering would like to think that you might use it temporarily to deal with what one might see as an overshoot in carbon dioxide. And I think that's quite possible. But temporarily, you know, we are talking about ships that, as Peter was saying, have lifetimes of millennia. So I don't think you would think that geoengineering would ever be something that you do for a few years and then forget about, unless something very terrible happened. I mean, again, I'd take the example, I think, and it's not just a debating point, I do think that what human beings have done to the nitrogen cycle is sort of a form of geoengineering, by changing the way a basic biogeochemical cycle on the planet works. And at the moment, there is no clear way that it would be possible to feed the people on the planet if we didn't do all that, do a good part of that nitrogen fixing. And so I think to some extent, some forms of geoengineering, if you accept that, might be here to stay. There may be aspects of how the world works that people want to say, well, okay, we're going to take that on for the long term. I don't think that's necessarily the case in climate. I wouldn't rule it out.
What political systems do you think should be put in place to govern this? And do you think that if politicians knew that geoengineering could solve their problems, would that just lead to greater apathy, and would the need for CO2 reduction, do you think that would take place?
I think there's a genuine, I think that what Matt referred to as the moral hazard is a genuine part of this discussion. I think that if people honestly believe that geoengineering can solve significant problems, that means that they will be less likely to pursue other ways of doing so. That means that it would be a good idea if they had those beliefs, that those beliefs should be right, and the best way to make them right is to have them widely critically tested. So I think that there's, I think the issue is a real one, that people might do less of other things if they believe geoengineering could work. But I don't think that's necessarily a reason for not trying to find out whether geoengineering can work. And I must say I'm at odds with quite a lot of the scientific community, including the magnificent Lord Rees on this. I think it's very dangerous to think about geoengineering purely in terms of something to keep in your back pocket as plan B, because that way you get the harm of what you were discussing there. You get the idea that people won't pursue other things because they'll think, oh, we've got this insurance policy. You'll be putting all the risk that Matt talked about so strongly of geoengineering onto future generations. So you'll be adding to their risks, but not giving them any benefit. That seems to me to be fundamentally wrong. So I do think that serious talk about geoengineering has to be talk about geoengineering that one might do without a specific emergency, that one might think about doing on an ongoing basis. I think it's quite important not to allow natural scientists to say, we really like researching this, we don't want to think about it, so we'll just say, if there's a huge disaster, then we'll use it. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it needs to be integrated more deeply into how people think about the climate.
Well, thank you very much.